Breaking news today: an independent Vatican? Take the Russian Orthodox as an example. Crux is proud to be an independent platform, but we rely on your support to keep it that way. What can you do to aid us? Think about it. The money you spend on coffee in the morning could make a huge difference in our lives. If every listener contributed just $3 a month, we could keep going, add more multimedia news stories, and delve deeper into the topics that matter most to you. We believe our reporting helps make the Church more open and robust. Please show your support if you agree. I really appreciate it. In an article about Vatican diplomacy published in 2007, the esteemed English news magazine The Economist offered some unasked for advice. A publication suggested that the Vatican could renounce its special diplomatic status and call itself what it is: the biggest non-governmental organization in the world. The French Archbishop at the time, Dominique Momberti, responded with a curt one-liner: "This is certainly not an acceptable invitation." In his opinion, this proposal showed a dangerously reductionist vision of the Holy See's place in global affairs. It's pretty much the same response the Vatican has given in the past whenever calls have arisen for it to give up its sovereign status, such as the tongue-in-cheek "Sea Change" campaign launched by Catholics for Choice, or whenever a government, for whatever reason, floats the idea of closing its embassy to the Vatican or perhaps combining it with their embassy to Italy. One can see how the argument could be made that Vatican sovereignty is a relic from the time of the Papal States, when the Pope served as a secular monarch over a large part of central Italy. Some people today argue that the Vatican is trying to avoid being held accountable by civil law by feigning sovereignty. For example, lawsuits filed against the Vatican in American courts over the clerical sexual abuse crisis have all been thrown out so far on the basis of sovereign immunity, without the claims being heard on their merits. The meeting on June 29 between Italian Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, Pope Francis's special envoy for peace in Ukraine, and Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, was a poignant reminder of why popes over the centuries have scratched and clawed to defend Vatican sovereignty. The meeting was the culmination of Zuppi's two-day visit to Moscow on June 28 and 29, following a similar trip to Kyiv earlier in the month. So far, the mission hasn't led to any breakthroughs in diplomatic relations, but it has shown that the Vatican is serious about maintaining open channels of communication. Just days after Kirill and his fellow Russian Orthodox prelates had staunchly supported Vladimir Putin during the brief insurrection of Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner Group mercenaries, Zuppi sat down with Kirill and the other prelates. "Any attempt to sow discord within the country is the greatest crime that has no justification," Kirill said to the Russian people. His words were clear: "I support the efforts of the head of the Russian state, Putin, to prevent unrest in their country." Respected Italian sociologist of religion Massimo Intravine published an essay in the wake of the compact pro-Kremlin Orthodox line in which he argued that while it may be exaggerated to say that Kirill saved Putin, such a claim risks overstating the Patriarch's influence, given that estimates of church attendance in Russia even for Easter and Christmas hover around 2 or 3%, but that Kirill and his fellow prelates nonetheless made clear that they Let's set the stage for the meeting that took place on June 29, a date that just so happened to coincide with the legendary Roman feast of Sts. Peter and Paul. Zuppi came as the Pope's special envoy because he has always gone his own way on the Ukraine conflict and has not been bound to any one country or group of nations. Francis is obviously not in the camp of the United States, United Kingdom, and NATO in arming Ukraine to the teeth, nor is he in the Putin echo chamber in calling the war a special military operation, and offering denazification as a justification. Francis's attempt to remain neutral is arguably closer to that of Brazil or South Africa or India and China than any of the contending parties, with the exception that Francis has no economic or military interests to gain or lose from his stance. That is to say, Zuppi has a good argument for presenting himself in Moscow as the representative of a global voice of conscience that is not the vassal of anyone or anything and with which one is free to agree or disagree. His companions, however, cannot make the same claim. Russian Orthodoxy has always considered itself to be the spiritual backbone of Russia's ruling class, but this was especially true during the Tsarist era. The Russian Orthodox Church has traditionally been viewed as the spiritual equivalent of the Russian government's other pillars of power: the military, the economy, and the military-industrial complex. More than 20 years ago, when Pope John Paul II decided to transform 4 apostolic administrations in Russia into dioceses, tensions between the Vatican as an autonomous, sovereign entity and the Russian Orthodox Church as a spiritual expression of Russia's national interests reached a head. The Moscow Patriarchate raised objections at the time, saying that the territory it had traditionally ruled over, which included not only Russia but also Ukraine, was its canonical territory, and that any attempt to spread Catholicism beyond that territory was unjustified proselytism. German Cardinal Walter Kasper, at the time the Vatican's top official for ecumenism, retorted that it is a ecclesiastical heresy to associate the Church with any particular culture or ethnicity because Christianity is, by definition, meant to be universal. Similarly, Swiss Cardinal Kurt Koch, Kasper's successor, said at the start of the war in Ukraine that Kirill's vehement defense of the Russian invasion amounted to heresy. This accusation was made 20 years after the fact. Koch said in 2022 that the issue lies in the relationship between church and state, which, in Orthodoxy, is seen and shaped in the sense of a symphony between the two realities. According to 2 Swiss newspapers in February, based on declassified state archives from the 1970s, it was determined that Archimandrite Kirill, who represented the Russian Orthodox Church at the World Council of Churches from 1971 to 1974, was actually an informant for the KGB under the codename Mikhailov. Despite the lack of a response from the Moscow Patriarchate, experts agree that it is highly unlikely that a Russian cleric living abroad at the time would not have had at least some contact with the KGB, given the close relationship between the two. To sum up, the Vatican's independence is both a symbol of its history of privilege and power and a buffer against the full weight of its mistakes in the present day. On the other hand, the Russian Orthodox Church provides a useful example of what Catholicism might look like if it did not have that guarantee of sovereignty. These people are the heirs to a great Christian tradition, to be sure, but their church is often seen, and not entirely without reason, as an extension of politics by other means.